Hello and welcome to the Monster Mechanics Podcast, where we take creatures of myth and media and see how they can be improved. I am your host, Scott Paladin, and with me, as always, is the share to my sonny, Zach Jaquays. Zach, what are we doing today?
Today we are talking about doppelgangers.
All right, doppelgangers. To give a little bit of background history, they're actually a real myth that comes originally from Germany. That's why we're using a German loanword. And the original myth, doppelgangers were almost always like a portent of bad luck.
Okay.
They're a subform of something called a fetch, which is an apparition of a living person, but it's when somebody sees an apparition of themselves. And they're commonly associated with, I saw myself earlier in the day, like in a crowd or something, and therefore something bad happens later in the day.
Gotcha.
So they weren't like a monster or anything. It was almost like a vision originally.
Or a phenomena almost.
Mm-hmm. Or a phenomena or like a hallucination or a portent. And then they've since grown in media since then to be a lot more different things. Sure. But in that original version, they were just sort of like a natural phenomenon or a supernatural phenomenon.
Sure.
And how are they used in D&D, Zach?
So in D&D, doppelgangers are a featureless humanoid creature that takes on the aspects of other humanoid creatures to impersonate them perfectly. They also have a form of telepathy that lets them read their target's minds or the minds of creatures they're interacting with.
Interesting. So to better mimic them.
Yes.
So I was thinking about these guys earlier this week. I'm just going to come out of the gate with an idea,
All right.
which is that there's another famous D&D creature, the Mimic, which in sort of mimetic form is always the treasure chest that when somebody goes to it, it tries to bite them.
Sure.
But they're creatures that can mimic sort of simple objects. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, this is interesting that we would have both that and something that mimics complex creatures. Mm-hmm. And I was like, there's no reason for these to be separate monsters. That seems to me like two stages of the same life cycle.
Okay. Where
they might start off as really featureless, not just like a faceless humanoid, but some like a blob or a slime. Mm-hmm. And then over time, as they become more developed and more complex, they start being able to mimic simple things. Like maybe they can just camouflage into a wall or a surface. And then as they get a little bit older, maybe they eat some more things. They start being able to mimic like chairs or tree stumps or doors or chests. And then the longer they go, the more complex and complete the illusion becomes.
Okay.
So that at some point they can graduate to like animals, like, okay, now I'm good enough to be a deer. Mm-hmm. And then all of this in kind of the service of getting close to their prey. And then eventually their shape-shifting abilities become developed enough that they can become humanoid and begin to perfectly mimic humanoids. And then in my head, the way I would go along was after that, at some point, they might even kind of forget that they weren't the humanoid that they were impersonating after a long time, which I kind of like.
Interesting.
But so how's that sound? You think we can play in that space? Or
I do like that idea. I'd like to take it further. What if there's a step after doppelganger, after it becomes that perfect mimic of a humanoid that after they've forgotten that they're this shape-shifting creature, but they keep going in this sort of progression, what kind of things would they actually move on to from there? What would be the next step in progression?
Okay, so let's give them a caveat, which is that they take a long time to do any of this.
Okay.
That they're not a rapid developer, I think. It takes them, centuries to go from a very simple slime to a perfect mimic of a humanoid. Okay. And then so they're going to be living in human society for a long time before they move on to the next thing, maybe. Sure. And maybe as they get more complex, they start being able to mimic not just like the physical form and behavior of creatures, but even like magical abilities.
Sure. Or how about this? What if instead of mimicking a single human, they start mimicking a society where an entire city could stem from a single mimic?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah. Well, you and I love hive minds. So that's, if we're going to go in that direction, let's go for it. They have to get to the point where they can mimic a human before they can sort of bud off and does that new bud have all of the same abilities, or does it have to go through the same growing process?
I could see it going either way at this point. However...
Oh, no, I think I've got an answer for that. If they're alone, it takes a long time. The more of them there are to sort of help each other and teach and hand down that knowledge, the quicker they develop. So if you've got one doppelganger that moves into a city, it takes a long time to go from mix stage to doppelganger stage. And then the next one doesn't take nearly so much time because it's got somebody to help it out. And then the one after that takes even less time, and the one after that takes even less time until if you get a sort of critical mass, it takes almost no time at all for them to get up to the doppelganger stage. I think that gives you a dynamic to play with there.
So you almost get like a gray goo sort of thing.
Yeah, well, it's exponential growth at that point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that. So this becomes like John Carpenter's The Thing, right? Where as they come in and sort of or the pod people, this is very sci-fi, where they slowly take over the society. So are they just going to expand exponentially until they've taken over everything, or do they have some sort of higher purpose?
Well, I like the idea that maybe there's just like this kind of innate curiosity in doppelgangers where they're trying to just continually evolve and build on themselves. But to an outside view, that's this horrifying thing that just sort of absorbs cities and makes them wrong.
Yeah, and doppelgangers, I like the idea that maybe to fully understand something, they kind of have to take it apart, which to them is just scientific curiosity and just want to further understand something.
Sure, and there's no difference to them between objects and people.
Exactly, it's just something else to figure out. And to an outside observer, it seems terrifying, but to them, they're just like, oh, this is what we do. Like this is just how we handle it. Yeah, and they do the same thing to the larger and larger entities that they come in contact with until the point where it's civilizations they're taking apart.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. Yeah, and then I guess the idea is at some point they would just sort of, if left unchecked, if nobody comes in and removes the threat, they would just take over the entire planet. And then for some reason, I think of them sort of ascending, like they get smart enough to mimic enough interesting things and gain enough interesting power that eventually they just leave to do the same thing somewhere else as a sort of intergalactic or even interdimensional colonization or parasitism.
Yeah, I like that.
That's really cool. Yeah, that's a hell of an idea hook. It's got horror in there. It's got sci-fi elements. So yeah, we were talking about them having to take things apart, but they still have to consume. Like the mimic is known for like biting people and like eating them. But is that really part of this new creature that we're coming up with biology, or is it something else they feed on? They could be very esoteric about it and pull energy or something like that, or they could still eat the meat.
I do like the idea that basically they're pulling apart everything to see how it ticks, basically. Whether they need to consume that or not, I mean, that can be up to the...
I think it's almost worse if they don't. Like, they don't need to do this. It's not like it's like hunger is kind of, because it's so venal that we kind of understand it, like we get it. But if they're just taking it apart and then leaving it there once they've sort of reduced it to its component parts. And, they're going to leave behind evidence and their motivation becomes less clear immediately. So and then also it means that doppelgangers are going to have to learn things. If they're mimicking humans and haven't yet, and they're still interacting with real ones, they're going to have to learn to do things like eat and drink if they don't normally have to do that. That makes them unnerving and alien in a really great way.
I like the idea of a big thing with doppelgangers, at least in D&D, is that like they'll kidnap someone and impersonate them. But if they're capturing humans or whatnot and interrogating them or sort of running simulations on interactions with normal people, but it's all tainted because the person is obviously terrified.
Yeah.
And so they build their actions and their personalities off these terrified individuals.
I think that might be like I think as they are imitating people, they actually have different stages of how they go about gaining that information. Like the first version of a doppelganger, especially one that doesn't have enough power to like take over people or maybe it can't even kidnap yet. It can just sort of like kill someone, mimic them physically, but then it didn't have enough time to interrogate them. So then it's just doing raw observation. It just watched this person for a certain amount of time and it got like all of the surface level stuff. Like it knows what laughter is, but not when to do it. And, it knows that they, this is their house, but they don't know how anything in the house works. And they're just sort of alienly moving through it and like just touching things and moving things around. And it's kind of like they physically got it, but their impersonation is imperfect. And then as they develop and get better at this over time, eventually it's, okay, well, we grab somebody that we want to impersonate, pull them aside. We get all the information out of it through interrogating them and like trying to gauge the reactions. And again, that's not going to be quite good enough.
Sure.
And then when they get sort of late stage doppelganger, where maybe there's a lot of them around and they have a lot of, they've been doing this for a long time. I think we just go full horror and they strap somebody to a chair and like directly interact with their brain to sort of nap that connectome. It's called, which is a connectome is a record of all of the connections inside of a system.
Okay.
So this would be essentially like looking at and be like, okay, this is how their brain is modeled. I'm going to use that as a way to map my behavior. And so then it doesn't matter whether you are giving them bad information or lying to them. They just got straight in. And I mean, you can go full body horror with that thing. If this is if these guys are real proper shapeshifters, they could just go in through the ear, like just shove like a finger in and just break the bone, and then like it would morph out and then like interact with everything inside. We're getting back to proper body horror there, but then it matters a lot of how far into this infestation you've gone as to how good they are at mimicking people. You know, they might become like a perfect simulation or simulacra of an individual, but with its own deep motives beyond that person's.
Interesting.
And it also means that if you're using them in a story, you can present them at different levels of competency and different levels of threat, because a single doppelganger by itself is pretty, I'm not going to say it's not threatening, but like it's not existentially threatening until it has a chance to sort of dig into a community and root it out.
Sure.
I like that. Yeah, you can imagine some characters leaving a place and being gone for a while and coming back and everything just being a little bit off.
Oh, sure.
And
especially if, say, those characters were just in a dungeon or whatever and that was infested with mimics, but they brought back some treasure, which they were unaware of, but that treasure was also mimics.
Oh, that's perfect.
And now they've transplanted that into the town.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Yeah, I like that hook a lot because you've built in foreshadowing that way, where you present them with, here's a threat that is known to mimic things, and then you are now responsible for introducing that threat to the community that you are using as a home base or whatnot, or just these innocent people.
Absolutely.
And then when we come back to it later, we get to see the ravaging effects of that. That's really hot.
Where your favorite bartender NPC is now being really weird in that kitchen. Like he's cooking things, but he's just burning it, or he's cooking the wrong things.
Yeah, you order your eggs one way and he gives them to you another way, or you order a light beer and he gives you wine, things like that, where it's just kind of just not right, you know, just a little bit off. I like that. Okay, so let's back up a couple of development stages back to the mimics. Let's kind of get into these guys a little bit.
Okay.
So if they're not going to eat meat, let's just assume they get their nutrients from, I don't know, something, or we can delve into the actual biology later, but they don't really need like meat to eat. But a mimic that is ready to move on to a more animate stage of existence might be looking for something to take apart. And so I'm imagining the sort of traditional mimic scene where you come up to a treasure chest and you reach your hand inside of it and it bites you.
Yeah.
And, you know, you have to struggle to get your hand out. And then, you know, you manage to get it. Maybe you kill the thing, maybe you don't, maybe it retreats. And then later, it manages to mimic like the hand that it got a hold of. That's all the information that it got. But it doesn't know what to do with it, so it's just moving around. Like is it the Thing from Addams Family?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Thing. This little hand walking across the floor.
Or maybe it tries to incorporate what it does know with this new information. And so now you have this chest that's just covered in hands.
Yes. Or like it opens up the lid and a hand comes out to grab you.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Oh, man. If you accept the idea that it's trying to figure this out and is going through experiments, those experiments are going to be wild. Like a mimic that's halfway between, it's going through that stage where it's moving away from inanimate objects and into basic creatures.
It's mimic puberty.
Yeah. That really awkward adolescent stage of a mimic where it's half chest, half deer, or like tree stump or a rock, and then also a bear, you know? And it hasn't figured these things out. That's really, that is disturbing.
Absolutely.
And it's trying to get the sounds right, but still doesn't have it. So it's like a bear that opens its mouth wide and like the sound of rocks clacking together comes out. Oh, that's good. I like that. See, this makes me want to run a D&D campaign again, despite the fact that I said I'd never would, just because that's a hot enough idea.
I think if there's anything that's going to get me back into a game like that, that would absolutely do it. So how do humans live in a world where there are creatures that can just, like, are these like a known threat that, like, we don't go to that continent, that's mimic territory?
I think a world with mimics has got to have a profound effect on the people in it.
Absolutely.
So how humans are going to react, I think, definitely matters a lot on how easy it is to detect these things. I liked have you seen John Carpenter's The Thing?
I've seen enough of it.
Right. So the scene I'm thinking of is when they've got the blood and it's like, I think it's in a petri dish and somebody's, if I recall correctly, it's been a long time since I've seen this, but I think they like heat up a fork or an iron or something like that, and they get the heat close to it and the blood reacts. Because there's no difference between the thing and its blood. Yeah. You could definitely go that way, where you have to get somebody's blood and do a test on it. But that's a pretty invasive, kind of difficult thing to test. Sort of at the other end of the spectrum is going to much more B-movie territory is They Live, where the guy's just got some glasses that he can put on and see that everybody's been replaced. Which sounds more interesting to you? I mean, obviously, the glasses are hokey. You come up with some other version of that, but does one of those jump out at you?
I like the idea that there are maybe culturally, there are different ways of doing it. Like there is a a manga series a while back called Parasite, where it was sort of a similar thing where this spacefaring alien creature was impersonating people and then eating people. But one of the tests they used was they would pluck a hair, and because it was just like part of a mimic, that hair would no longer have connection to the host body and then would sort of act autonomously. So it would kind of writhe in their fingers when it was plucked.
I like that. Okay, so yeah, I think you definitely need to get a hold, to do the definitive proof, I think you definitely need to get a hold of some bit of one of these creatures and then see how it reacts. That's pretty good. So you can imagine a society like that, like people carrying around whatever the technology level version of like a petri dish or test tube or some small clear enclosure so that you can put a bit of someone into it and then either expose it to stimuli or just observe it. You'd have to have something like checkpoints. If you're in a society that has seen these things in the past and is cognizant of them, then it's going to end up being like a very invasive police state where as you pass from city to city, they're going to want to see your blood. They're going to want a hair sample. They're going to want tissue samples. That's a very hard-handed way to handle it. And then if you can imagine maybe doppelgangers and mimics start in one area of the world, that the sort of neighboring countries are very militant against them and sort of act as a bulwark. And then, but if something got past one of those into a farther away area that isn't so aware, maybe it's like, oh, well, doppelgangers are just legends, to these people. And so it's like an infestation run amok because they have built up none of the tools to handle this infestation, this invasion. That's cool. Like if this is something that has developed over time, the people who are kind of grew up next to it are going to be really used to it and have built up defenses to it and be very observant.
Absolutely.
In fact, that might be kind of like a bonus feat you could hand anybody who grew up in one of those societies is just they are very observant about things like body language because they are looking for that. Sort of, if you're talking in game terms, they get a perception bonus or something along those lines just because they are used to it. They've got their antennas up.
I like the idea of mimics being sort of treated as like an existential threat by these societies where if they detect a nest, they go full on holy war against it.
Yeah, they go ham the moment that one of these things happen because if you know about it, you have to take it out then because they could disappear overnight and you might not be able to ever find them again.
Absolutely.
And they could, depending on their size, they could quite rapidly take over. Yeah, absolutely. If we're talking about this sort of in the classic D&D role-playing context, that's definitely a good early quest for some young adventurers. Going in and taking out an infestation is, I think, classic, like level 4 material, right?
Like, congrats, you've upgraded from rats. Now go deal with this small dungeon.
Although, if they are aware of these creatures, that does remove some of the surprise of that first time. I think actually people sometimes overestimate how good that surprise is, though, because I think better than that is the tension of knowing that anything that you interact with might be a creature.
Sure.
So if you walk into an abandoned house or something like that, or a house that wasn't abandoned, it's just empty now, and you know that there are mimics in the area and that's what you've been sent to look for, then you're going to be walking through those rooms sort of expecting that every object might be...
Sure, waiting for that jump scare.
Yeah, waiting for that jump scare. And you're inevitably going to have some people who are like, well, no, screw it, we're just going to torch the thing from afar. But then you don't know that you got everything. Like you haven't actually confirmed it because part of the process I think needs to be, especially at that stage, confirming that they're still there. I think if you're going to give them a weakness, making them all sort of stick together, knowing that they're reluctant to go out on their own because they develop so much more slowly when they're on their own.
Yeah, I like that.
So that when you come into an area where you suspect they might be, you need to confirm that they're there before you blow everything up with a fireball, which requires the characters to get in close. And okay, so here's a question. How rapidly do they actually change form?
In D&D, it's usually considered to be like the blink of an eye. However,
so really fast.
Yeah, they can change form within a standard round or 6 seconds or so.
Ooh, wow. That's very powerful.
Yes.
Because, I mean, the idea that you could...
run around a corner and suddenly you're a lampshade.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think that definitely seems like the kind of thing that, like the doppelganger stage of this creature, where you are very advanced and very good at what you do, that definitely makes sense. And then you have the added bonus of it being an intelligent creature that is going to be thinking about it and strategizing. For maybe the less developed, more mimic stage, I like the idea that it's slower, that you get to see more of the in-between stages.
I do like that. Yeah.
And especially if they're going into like a form they've never tried before, like a mimic that at one point been a chair and at one point been a chest. Going from chair to chest isn't that big a deal for it. But going from chair, if it's been a chair and a chest, going then to fox is it's really hard. Yeah. And so you get the in-between stages. But I like, if it is something that's relatively fast, they're not taking weeks to move from one form to another. Maybe it takes weeks to learn a new form, but to move from one form it knows to another being relatively quick means that they might respond to immediate threats by changing form.
Interesting.
If you are, let's say you are wrestling with a bear that is actually a mimic, and you kind of get over on it, if that's possible, that you've got it in a situation where it is stuck. You got it, you Winnie the Pooh'd it, and it now is stuck in the side of a tree or like in a stump or a hole that it can't quite fit through. The idea that this is a shapeshifter, it's going to use that shapeshifting to solve problems. If it's already in combat, it might suddenly turn into a snake, or it might elongate itself into like a giant weasel-like form. That's just a bear that's stretched out so that it can get through. Is very cool. That sounds like a real nasty thing to deal with.
So I also like the idea of mimics that don't really behave how you would expect. Like the classic example of a mimic is the chest where the lid opens up and it bites you. But I like the idea of it not really understanding functional elements and how they would, like the functional elements of a chest and how they would fit into this.
For sure.
So instead of, the lid opening up and it biting you, like it might just split straight down the middle and then a bunch of tentacles just launch out and grab you and pull you in.
Absolutely. It just waits for you to get close enough. So it may know the shape of a chest, but not like how hinges work.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that might be something that it learns over time as it observes different things. Like it would have to see not just the chest, but the chest being opened in order to understand, that's how it's supposed to behave.
And then they start taking those things that they learned from earlier in life, like those hinges and whatnot, and now you've got a bear with hinges, which kind of, opens up where the head pops open.
Yeah.
And it's got gold inside the bear or whatever.
I like that. Yeah, definitely. If you bring these things into combat and they do something weird and that is their way of attack, that is awesome. If you have a creature that, like we said, if this is a mimic that looks like a bear, don't treat it like a bear. Like exactly. that, you're wasting the opportunity if it just acts like a bear. It needs to act like all of the things it could be. It might, depending on how far the actual powers of mimicry work, it might do things like it had been a lantern in the past, and so it just like casts light and it emits smoke.
Interesting.
Or it had been ropes, and so it has the ability to spawn ropes from it and use those as an attack because it's like these tentacle-y things. I think that, so we need to give maybe some complex behaviors into them a little bit more.
Okay.
Because we've given them some sort of broad drives, but I think giving them like mimics cannot ever not be something else. Like the original form of them, I think we described it as like a slime or a goo, and the longer they go and the more things they develop, the farther they get from that goo form. And so if they are going to become something else, they have to have observed it, seen it, and then been it.
Okay.
That removes the ability for them to just sort of be like, oh, now I've got 50 tentacles and a beak in the middle of me, despite the fact that this has never seen something that was like that. And they have to have observed it, which means it does give them some limitations. If they haven't ever figured out the object before, they can't just immediately do it. And it limits them sort of like, it's a mimic. They are a mimic. They don't get to create. Except to maybe that is like one of the last things to develop for them as they're going through this developmental stage, late doppelganger. They're like, oh, what if I did something I haven't seen before? And that's like
where they learn creativity.
Yeah, exactly. They become sort of more than just a mimic at that point.
I also like the idea that maybe in your campaign or your story, you've got this doomsday device where it would be terrible if a mimic was able to mimic this thing. Like if it...
Oh, okay.
Like there are certain things that like if a mimic touches this or comes to understand it or is able to mimic this object or creature or thing, that's game over.
Yeah. So if, the longer they go on, the more complex they get, they might get to the point where they can, like I think I might have mentioned earlier, mimicking the abilities of creatures, like magical abilities.
Sure.
And so something like a blink dog is pretty bad all by itself, or a displacer beast or something like that. Something that has the ability to teleport makes them a lot more of a dangerous threat. They have an immediate escape route, and it's not something
that can't be pinned down anymore.
Exactly. And they can kind of go wherever they want. So maybe it's not just the one, like a creature with clairvoyance or something like that, where it has the ability to see everything on the planet would be very bad for mimics because they're able to then observe everything.
Yeah, that'd be
actually, yeah. just keeping them away from divination magic or anything that allows them to sort of extend their senses, because it gives them the ability to observe more.
So you give them, like if they encounter creatures with blind sense or tremor sense, and they're suddenly able to experience things in a whole new way and thus take things apart in a whole new way.
Yeah. I also kind of, if we're going to give them sort of weaknesses, the thing that comes to mind is something like, sort of like obsessive compulsive disorder, but not exactly, not like, oh, I have to go back and check the stove every time. But the thing I'm thinking of is that when they are figuring something out, they are incredibly meticulous about it. And when they take it apart, they lay it out. They have to have space to do that. They can't just like, they have some ability to like just observe something, but to properly get all of the information out of it, they really need to take it apart. And for that, they need space and time. And you know what knolling is?
No, I don't.
Okay, so Google it sometime. It's the act of taking lots of objects and laying them out very meticulously.
Okay.
So, I'm going to take all the screws out of this thing, and they all go in a line, and then this assembly goes directly below it, a nice little arranging them in a way that is very clear. There are people who've taken apart like F1 engines and then knolled all the parts, and it's beautiful. Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
I've seen images like that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure doppelgangers have to do that with people.
Ugh. I hate it and I love it.
Yeah. In order to properly mimic something, especially if it's like going from one human to another, maybe that's not too hard. But the first time you see something new, like an orc is different enough that you go, okay, I really got to get my hands into that thing, to see that laid out. And that's a scene that you can leave behind for other characters to see as a big shock value scene.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you come in and you see all these bones and organs laid out in a very carefully handcrafted pile.
Yeah. And it also means, again, it gives them limitations. If you have something that is so powerful that just by observing your, characters once, it could mimic any one of them, that does give you a certain amount of paranoia over any one person could be a mimic at any time. But giving them some limitation does give you a tool to work with in defeating them. And so giving them an element like, okay, for new things, they need time and space and the ability to work through it, makes them vulnerable for a period of time. In fact, the act of doing it might be so consuming for their attention that you could actually even make them, they might be literally vulnerable in the sense that you could walk up right behind one.
I also like the idea of being able to foreshadow these mimics by having much less of that shock value. Like you find basically like little piles of gravel that are meticulously laid out as it was trying to understand a rock in its early stages of life, or
yeah, absolutely,
or disassembled chests or something.
Yeah, things taken apart and laid out into these, like, for them it's just them working out its function, but to people it might actually be sort of beautiful, sort of pretty. And for visual inspiration, look up bowerbirds, and I cannot remember the name of this kind of fish. There's a kind of fish that does the same sort of thing of collecting lots of little objects and laying them out. This would be sort of leavings of doppelgangers.
Interesting.
Yeah. One thing that's really interesting about, to me, the bowerbirds and the fish is that they do it in a way that is, we find it aesthetically interesting and pleasing, but it's also not human. Like, it's kind of hard to imagine a human doing it, like thinking of it that way. And that's a good way to sort of emphasize their otherness, their alienness.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. Oh, so these guys definitely seem like an infestation, like they are not of whatever world they're, if you are setting this in a world, I don't think that they should ever really be from that world. They kind of have to be something that has come in from elsewhere, either another dimension or like a parallel world, or just sci-fi style. They landed on a rock or a spaceship or something like that, because they seem very alien, and that emphasizing that to your players is good, which means their chemistry might not be anything like our own.
Sure.
Yeah, that's cool. So circling back to the societies.
Okay.
The ones that have encountered them might be very paranoid about it. Is there anything other effects they might have? Like, I mean, could you harness a mimic in some way? Like, is there a way to get a hold of one of these doppelgangers and to make it work for you?
That's a pretty common trope in D&D. However, with a creature as alien as this, you would have to figure out basically what motivates it, and sort of, I would imagine, do sort of a carrot kind of situation, where maybe this society is providing this mimic things it wants to know about in exchange for it doing something for them.
So you have to make a sort of devil's bargain with it.
Absolutely.
And hand it, on the one hand, maybe you have a set of adventurers going out to capture a griffin alive so that we can hand it over to this thing in order to pay for it to do an assassination in another country or something. And then on the other side of that same coin, you have one of these things being sent in. And I don't think you'll ever really properly control one of these things.
Oh, absolutely not.
That if you're making that deal, it's going to be in the background doing its own thing as well. And it's a really risky bargain.
Because this thing, I would imagine, wouldn't really have any, it wouldn't really have any understanding of trust or loyalty or anything like that. It's doing what's in its own best interest at any given moment.
Sort of by their nature, like these creatures kind of don't think of any other sentience as mattering. Like a rock, a dog, and a human are all kind of the same thing to these creatures.
Sure.
And if interacting with them in a way that gets to my benefit makes sense, okay, we'll do that. But the moment that it doesn't matter anymore, they're not going to stick around for it.
Yeah.
Because you don't matter. You literally do not exist to it.
And the most dangerous thing to be interesting to a mimic.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So they might have sort of divided the world in their heads into things that change and things that don't.
Okay.
And because they are fluid, because they have the ability to be all things, that makes them what matters. The things that don't change over time are just sort of, who cares? There's no value there. It's the same thing all the time. And so they might have a limited amount of respect for things like caterpillars turning into butterflies.
Interesting.
Because that is a form of change that they find interesting and sort of can relate to because they see themselves in it. Similarly, things like chameleons and cephalopods that can change the texture and color of their skin. A doppelganger might look at that and see themselves in it. It's like one of the few things on a world like ours that they might go, oh, I understand that.
What if these doppelgangers have a profound respect for druids with their shape-shifting abilities?
Yeah, that was where I was thinking next, is that magical shape-changing, which exists in a lot of different systems, might give them oh, okay, I get you on that level. In fact, you can almost see, a society where has been completely taken over by mimics. A kingdom has completely been subsumed. And then you have one person who comes in and double buffs them where he pretends to be a mimic. I mean, we're getting meta level on that one,
but
it's
absolutely
fun. The longer that we've talked about this, I think the less that it's a hive mind. I think they do share information between each other.
Sure.
But I think the individuals amongst it sort of still are, they're not all just extensions of one mind.
Okay.
But that being together is very important because, again, if they've divided the world into things that change and things that don't, and the only thing they can sort of relate to is other ones that change, then other mimics, other doppelgangers, it would be so lonely if you didn't have them around. It's for a human, it would not just be like being without other humans, but it'd be like being on a completely alien world, something where even the physics don't really make sense. You are so beyond your depth that you have to meticulously study everything in order to be able to understand it.
Interesting.
And whereas other creatures that change, they are very relatable. You're like, oh, okay, I get you. You and I share so much. And so it's very important that we stick together because the rest of the world is kind of scary. Well, not scary, but it's so alien and not comforting. Yeah. You could sort of imagine them in a world where they don't get the fact that things stay the same. They don't get it. Somewhere on a fundamental level, they just are uncomfortable with it.
I imagine there's a case where when they're taking apart things, they're trying to force it to change, perhaps.
Oh, that's an excellent variation on the idea. Where especially as they've developed and they're getting to their later stages, and they're sort of thinking okay, I understand how they are. Could I make them something else? Is really interesting. They might experiment, especially if they have the ability to sort of take people apart. You might see them trying to put them back together in a different way,
and maybe doppelgangers take each other apart all the time, but it's not. It doesn't really have any effect on them.
That would be how they might transfer knowledge of certain forms or how things work. If one of them has gone out and encountered a manticore, let's say,
sure,
and taken it apart and really understands the manticore, when it comes back to the society, it becomes a manticore and is taken apart by other doppelgangers who learn from that, and then they themselves can become manticores and be taken apart. And so that's how that knowledge might spread from doppelganger to doppelganger.
Interesting.
Again, they don't, not that they'd care that it kills the creature. Obviously, they know that that if you take apart a human that they don't get back together. But, they weren't doing it because it didn't seem like an evil act to them. Like, oh, unfortunately it kills them, but whatever. Like, I do this all the time. They should just toughen up.
If you want to go like real horror, what if they could take apart something and keep it alive while it's taken apart?
They definitely have to do it longer than they should be. I don't think they get all the way. Like taking you down to your component bits, that's a little too far for just believability.
Sure.
But I think definitely pushing how far that goes. And it does make kind of sense where the longer this thing stays alive, the more you're able to observe, as you're taking it apart, the more you're able to observe the systems that make it work. And so taking a lung out of a human and looking at it is useful, but seeing the lung in place as it moves and as it does its job is much more useful. So yeah, they have an incentive to do that. It's not just something you would do just for the horror. It actually makes sense in the fiction. And at the same time has the bonus effect of being awful.
Oh, yeah.
They might even, as they're taking something apart, stimulate it in certain ways and things that we would see as torture, but it's them inducing reactions that they can observe, which is an important part to them seeing it.
Sure.
And we were talking about how this takes time and they need to be able to do it. If they're interrupted partway through, they might still have gotten some of the knowledge. So they might be sort of reduced to that stage where they can kind of imperfectly mimic something. And but if it's useful to them, they have the ability to draw on it. If they have if they've taken apart a giant, or if they got halfway through a giant and you attack them, they might take what they've already learned about it and start using that against you, growing their limbs very large to gain the strength, or using some particular adaptation of one of the creatures that they've been working on, things like that.
Sure.
That sort of mix and match during their combat is something that would be worth leaning into, especially if their secret's not known, if they're still undercover. Obviously, they're going to be trying really hard to maintain the illusion, but like the moment that they're a mimic, they're going to take all the holds off. Yeah, and I think they become much more dangerous at that point.
Absolutely. When they have nothing to lose and they're going to use every trick they've learned put together in very weird and unnatural ways.
Oh, for sure. So if we're these things are modeled a lot off the thing from that movie. If I remember correctly, fire was just about one of the few ways it was properly damaged, right?
I believe so, yes.
I think that's a pretty good way to go. I mean, something that you could go with, just drop most of the physical attacks as weaknesses. Like this thing isn't really going to be long-term killed by cutting its head off. Like that's just not going to do it. But chemical attacks or electricity, fire, maybe even cold, things like that could attack its sort of cellular structure. Not just the large physical parts of its body, might be the only way to really damage these things.
So things like fire, acid, cold, things that break cell walls.
Yeah, really strong acids, really strong bases too. I've always thought that was funny about D&D is they've got acid attacks, but like, come on, you should be able to have basic attacks too, right? Oh God, this is apropos of nothing, but if you had a wizard that was specialized into it, they would definitely be a basic bitch.
Oh God.
I might cut that one, but
please do.
It just came to me and I had to say it. Yeah. So on that note, we were talking about the societies that are primed to deal with these doppelgangers and mimics. That might be one of the ways in which they have sort of geared up for it, is by becoming really good with those techniques. In fact, if everybody's really good at them, they might have dropped things like swords and bows and arrows entirely, because fire works pretty well on humans too. And if you're really good with it, because you needed to fight one enemy, you might as well be using it to fight another. You would see that reflected in the tools of that society at large. Everyone might have either a flamethrower or a flaming sword or a taser or a wand of lightning or shocking grasp or something like that, whatever's appropriate. But the people who've been affected by it would definitely have all of those tools like ready and at their exposure. They would definitely have those tools ready and at their disposal.
Going back to the idea of new things being interesting to a mimic, societies would sort of adapt by everyone becoming very homogenous. Haircuts, there's a lot less individuality in the people there.
Really?
As they kind of try to become less enticing to mimics.
As a sort of an adaptation just to make themselves less desirable. That's an interesting way, because I would have thought it would go the other way, where everybody would make themselves very different, because then if you learn about the behavior and appearance of one, that you don't necessarily then have the ability to mimic everyone. That's where true. You've like, okay, well, you know how to look like Bob, but Bob and I don't look a lot alike because, Bob does face paint and I have feathers in my hair or something like that.
Sure.
And so that therefore it would take you a long amount of time to get me. And maybe, the fact that you and I had different ideas about it means that people in the societies might have different ideas about it. And so you could see Nation A taking your approach where they've all become very homogenous and trying to basically fly under the radar and let the mimics go after other people.
Yeah.
And then you might have versions that took my approach where it's like, no, we're going to all be very different in order to make it hard on the mimics when they come after us.
Or they have to try to learn every single person to, I could definitely see that being the case as well.
And we were talking about like the road checks where you had to like provide hair or blood or something like that. But there could be like rituals as part of like deal making. Like we have the handshake. They might have something like where you put like a weak acid on your palm and the two of you shake hands. And
interesting.
At the moment that it's like at that moment of touch, it's like, oh, okay. Like if one of you was a mimic, that might be enough of a trigger.
You'd be having a real bad time right now.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can build those things into those societies. In fact, what would be, this is a little bit off topic, but what's fun is to do those things. Think about that pressure and then take away the source of it and not mention it. Think about these ideas about like how these societies would work, what would have been causing them, and then be like, oh no, we killed all the mimics like 50 years ago. But we have all of these things that hang around in our society that were specifically designed to work against them, but now they're kind of purposeless.
Yeah.
Those things will make your world feel very lived in and organic.
Absolutely.
So thinking about stuff like that would be really cool to have like as a lingering tradition. And then you'd be like, well, why was it, that this was the case? Oh, well, it's because 50 years ago, this was a very important part of their, or 100 years ago or whatever, very, very important part of their society.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, we're coming up on an hour, and I think we've got pretty good stuff here.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to call the episode right there.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Monster Mechanics. Additional information and show notes can be found at our website, monsterpod.org. If you'd like to support us, head on over to patreon.com/monsterpod. We'd love to hear your feedback. We can be reached on Twitter at monstermpod, or you can email us at monstermechanicspodcast@gmail.com. Monster Mechanics is produced and edited by Scott Paladin. This episode was hosted by Scott Paladin and Zach Jaquays. All of the ideas generated in this episode are released on a do what the fuck you want public license.